Okay, kinesiology 230, chapter number 5, presentation number 3. We're talking acute responses to resistance training, and this is going to focus more on the neurological component. Let me tap my screen here and get it activated. So here we are in that chapter overview, and we're now into acute responses to training. Let's go ahead and jump into this. They have 3 main body systems for acute responses. They list neurological, muscular, and endocrine. And you're going to hear a lot of things kind of repeated over and over here, but hopefully it helps to get things to sink in. That's the whole idea. But I want to reflect back to one of the comments I made in the first presentation where I like how the book kind of describes this as acute responses and chronic adaptations. Because if you have this acute training program, something short-term that you do over and over and over a long period of time, it becomes chronic. And you have these responses that happen in the moment, but they create adaptations in the body long term. And I like the verbiage they use here, and I like how this is written in here. And I think it really stresses this, is the habitual nature of fitness and sport performance. It's not just one session that brings the results, it's the consistency of habit that brings the adaptations. And I really am on board with that. That's an Adrian annotation. That's not a book annotation. That's me just processing what's in the book, and it's just my coaching background coming out there. I really like how the book is presenting this information. All right, so they have 3 main body systems for acute responses: neurological, muscular, and endocrine. We're going to jump into neuro right now. You may remember this stuff to the right. Let me get my mug out of the way here. Over to the right, you had the synaptic cleft. You had calcium release. The calcium release would allow for binding on the active site, and that'll happen when the electrical impulse came in through the T tubule and released the calcium, etc., from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the sarcoplasm. All right, so here's the deal. You have a signal that comes down, zap, and it causes the activation of a skeletal muscle, and it causes the motor unit to fire, which we know that already. And there's a cascade of events that we've already talked about, and we know it's zap, cleft, calcium in here. Calcium gets released in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which causes greater binding here. So it's a whole series of events. It's not just like a one-off thing. And I stress this in one of the other presentations. It's a series of events that happens in a fraction of a second, which is just amazing when you think about it. But it's created by a voltage change within the sarcolemma itself. And so you have, for the action potential, it is something that happens where you have minus 70 millivolts, and it causes a depolarization and repolarization that happens back and forth across the cell membrane, which is not in the context of what we're talking here, but it's something you'll see in like 236 or some of your other classes. But just realize that the terminology we'll focus on will be action potential for that. All right. So when you talk about motor unit recruitment, heavier tasks will require different motor unit recruitment than fine motor unit activities, and then rate coding. We've talked about these, right? Refers to the firing rate or the number of action potentials per unit of time. And they kind of jump back into this as a precursor to some of the other stuff we're going to talk about. But again, get back to, if you want to move your eye, it's going to require a different amount of motor units than your leg if you're doing leg press. Your fingers, to do very dexterous work, are going to require a different amount of motor units than your glutes when you're doing squats. It's just that simple. Just kind of keep that in mind in terms of fine motor units, or fine movement versus gross movement, and the number of motor units that would be required to make that movement happen. All right, so the book here, I think, does a good job in terms of the process of rate coding. And during a set of resistance exercise, motor units in the muscle, they're activated. And I talked about this in terms of graphically how you have this kind of rate coding, and also you have this firing of the motor unit that doesn't allow for complete relaxation in between. Within this, when I talk about motor unit recruitment, they talk about the size principle. And what they're getting at in this chart, just so you can kind of wrap yourself around it, the lower threshold motor units, and we've talked about this, the lower threshold motor units are type 1s down here. And as there's greater force production, the motor units themselves go from type 1 to type 2, and you have the motor units progression, type 1 to type 2, and the force production goes higher and higher and higher. So they kind of run concurrent to one another. If you need greater force production, you have to have motor units that are going to be very type 2B, maybe type X if you're kind of in between here. But at the end of the day, what happens is it changes the recruitment threshold in terms of the electrical side of the equation. So, as the demand for, and I love this right here, as the demand for force output increases during a sprint or maximal leg exercise on resistance loaded device, low threshold and high threshold motor units and muscle fibers innervated by these motor units are simultaneously recruited to meet this demand. So it's not we're only using type 1, we're only using type 2. You're going to have a mix of these. Don't think otherwise. But what will happen is when you have higher power tasks that need to be completed, you're going to be up in this region. If they're lower power tasks, very oxidative, you're going to be down here. All right, signing off, moving on.